Hi, it's Mark back with another tutorial, and today we're in the wonderful world of Lightroom, and we've been going through a whole series of tips and tricks I've picked up over the months and years in the develop module, particularly around using adjustment brushes and the like. So for example, did you know that while, let's say, we're putting an exposure on here, something daft like that, and you go over the edges, did you know you don't have to come over here and click auto mask in order to stay inside and then switch it off again when you're doing things that you don't need to? Well, if you didn't, this is the video for you. We've got lots of tips similar to that. Hopefully you'll find them useful and come away with at least one of them that you've not done before. So let's play the titles and roll the sleeves up and get cracking. Okay, thank you for staying with me after the guitar strains jingle into the distance. We'll start with that first tip, shall we? The one about auto masking. Now, and why would you want to use it? Well, if I was wanting to lower the exposure of this overall rock base here, I would probably bring the exposure down, use a brush tool, and I would paint over it like this. Now, please bear in mind, I don't actually edit like this. I'm doing things far more rough so you can see them. There's no point in me being subtle on the amount of exposure I'm using here if you can't see it very well on YouTube. For example, if that exposure amount had just been about a quarter of a stop or something, just ever so slightly to take that off. You may or may not be able to see that. I think you probably can when I'm switching it off and on. But isn't it far easier for demonstration purposes if I've got it nice and dark? Because I'm not teaching you here anything about this edit on this picture. I'm teaching you about the tools and techniques to use. So I will be heavy-handed where necessary, just as a visual aid. So I'm darkening the things, and we know that if I get too close, I showed you before, without auto masking, it can come out, or I can try and be very precise. But occasionally I might slip outside. So normally you'd come, switch auto mask on, and then knowingly you wouldn't go outside. You can just paint all the way down here and it won't go outside. Control Z, Control Z, Control Z. But then you'd switch it off again. Why would you not have it on all the time? Well, let's undo some of what I've done so far. Right, if I've got auto mask on and I paint the shoreline here, and open to these trousers, open to these cottages, where the dickens did trousers come from? Never mind. Open to these cottages. Let's make it a bit more noticeable. You'll see there are places where it hasn't applied, such as this rock, around the window stanchions and so on, because auto mask is doing its job. It's saying, look, there's a border here, and that looks like it's an edge, so I'm not actually going to go over the edge. But that actually stops me doing what I want to do. Now, if I wanted to do this to the whole island, that could be a nuisance. So I would rather have it off so that I can roughly do the whole thing quickly like this, and then switch it on close to the edge. And rather than come over here and click it on to do my bit close to the edge without spilling over the side, and then switch it off again, I can simply hold my command button or control button if you're on a PC. So I will start up here to demonstrate this. So clearly I'm outside, but if I was to hold the command, it comes back on. Command off, and do the other side, command, and command off. So by just pressing down on the command button, there's no visual clues. You don't see this all of a sudden change over here. No visual clues other than what you've got on the screen. Okay, so that's the first tip. And while I'm on that, let's get rid of this particular brush, and let's put some, let's say I did want to lower the exposure on this as a genuine edit, but I wanted a visual aid of what I was doing. Well, there's two things you can do. Most people know about pressing O to introduce an orange mask, so that when you paint, you don't see the effect, you see the overlay. O for overlay rather than O for orange, right? The next version of doing that, or switch it off again, is to do what I suggested. There's nothing to stop us painting like this, really heavy-handed, so we can see where we're going, see what we're doing. Hold on my command key to run up beside the lighthouse there, so the mask comes on, and then I can see exactly where I've done, and I can come back here and I can just fine tune what it is I want, knowing I haven't missed a bit. So I can come back. So as well as having overlay, which is often used as a tool to show where you've been, you can actually be heavy-handed with certain effects. Things like exposure, things like saturation, you would notice. Not necessarily all of them. So that's another tip thrown in there. Sticking with some areas, here's the next tip. Create yourself some space to one side and delete that one. We're not interested in that. And sticking with the brush, we can brush in straight lines. So we can, as we looked at before, and I'm not good auto mask on here, I can click once there and try and draw and stay inside the line, or I can click once there, bring my brush down here, hold down the shift key, press click, and there's a straight line. So you can use straight lines and they can be useful. This technique is particularly useful with adding light rays, which we'll do in the next picture. But just to demonstrate, while I've got a lighthouse here, and albeit this is so false because it's daylight and you wouldn't see it anyway, let us bring the exposure up. Forget about this down the side. Click there once and click, hold my shift and click there. There you are, that's a Star Wars laser type light, but it doesn't look like that in real life, does it? So let's Control Z, let's click once there, let's really feather the brush, let's bring the brush much bigger and click once there. So now we've got a feathered effect, which our brush stroke goes from small to large. Just add another one just to demonstrate that. Come in here, right on the very top, click once, move it up the top, not that the light would ever come out the top, and click. So there you are. You've got a way of showing scattered light, which is very good for windows. So that is the next tip, the fact that you can use straight lines, which you probably knew about, but changing the width between the start and the finish. Hopefully you'll find that very useful. Let's go and get another picture we can actually do this on. So this picture was taken inside the church at Masham or Masham, depending on how you wish to pronounce it, and which is famous for being where Theakston's brewery is, of which Theakston's Old Peculiar isn't the nectar of the gods, and is what is blazoned on my hat, if you want to rewind and have a check of that. But I'm not sponsored, unfortunately, not even in beer. Right, so good candidate this for a light beam, because we see where the light has clearly fallen. We've got a pool here and we've got some bright windows. So let's just address one. So using the technique we've just talked about, brush tool, and we want to up the exposure, that's fine, possibly add a little bit of dehaze as well. And we'll click, get rid of this one, there's already one there. We'll click up here to start our brush. Let's see what our brush looks like. Just see how I've got quite a generous feather on. You can tell from over here, but I always find it best just to see what the circles look like on screen. So I'm going to take that to roughly the size, the width of the pane, and just take it there. One click, bring it down here, using the right bracket key or the slider. I'm holding down the right bracket key. I'm going to make it quite large, and it doesn't matter that a lot of it is off the canvas. You can see where the feather radius is and where the solid is. I'm going to click, sorry, I'm going to hold my shift key and do another click. And there is a light beam coming in. Too strong, but then I did push it up deliberately so to show where the effect comes in. Let's back it off a little bit. While we're down here, let's do another one coming back. So I'm just going to move this over slightly and do one click. And then I'm going to reduce the size to something small again, befitting the window pane. And hold down my shift key and do a second click. So there, we've added more of the effect and lightened up the room and the edges of this art installation that was there at the time, down to the natural pool of lights. So if we just go and switch that off and then back on, you can actually see the spread of the light. Obviously still a bit too strong. I'd want to, in real world editing, I'd want to tone that down and possibly look at the other windows too. But that's one good way we combine some of these tips. Let's move on to something else now. So sticking with the Theakston's old peculiar theme, for no other reason that was the folder I happened to be in for the last picture. This is inside the one of the workshops where they traditionally make the barrels. So there's lots of detail and interesting shapes in here. It doesn't really matter what we're going to do regarding the edit, but this, we're going to use the brush tool again. This tip is particularly for where you adjust more than one thing. So let us say that I wanted to, why not, we'll see, we've got a light flare up here. Let's bring what we did previously. So let's bring the exposure up a little bit, click up there, widen it, as almost as if that's a leak through from a hole in the roof or something. And there we've got a bit of a flare coming down there, but I also want to put in it a bit of colour. So bring a bit of yellow into that, and let's add a bit of haze on it as well to really make it start to stand out. Again, I'm going over the top so you can see the effects. Now, I've deliberately chose to change more than one item on this one brush, because now I want to show you a quick way of making changes to all of those things in proportion. Now, there's two ways to do this. You may have come across this by accident, in which case you'll know it already. But if we see this little triangle here, if I click that, it takes everything down to just an amount. An amount of what? Well, it's the amount of that temperature being up, that exposure being up, that dehaze being up, and that saturation being up. We'll see this in operation in a minute, but if you just remember the dehaze is right over the left and I've bumped those other ones to the right. Let's go back to that now. I'm watching the screen. I can alter what I've had set on my brush. And if we were to pop back in just to eyeball it, you'll see that the dehaze has come to the right and the others have come back to the left. So let's put that back up. Another way of visualizing this is to actually hover over the pin that you created when you first started your brush. And if you hold down the Option key or the Alt key on a PC, you'll notice it changes to a vertical bar with an arrow to either side. Now, if I click now and drag my arrow to the right, and if you have a look at the sliders on the right hand side of the screen, the dehaze is going back towards the middle. They're all tending towards the middle. Those that were on the left are actually heading back to the right, and those that were on the right are heading back to the left. All right. Had you have had your overall amount somewhere in the middle, then this allows you to hold down the option. As well as going to the left, you could go to the right and take them further. Okay, but as soon as one of them hits 100%, it stops. So the dehaze hits 100% down here. The dehaze hits 100%. It has to stop because it can no longer move all of the sliders you've adjusted in proportion if one of them is forced to stop. So there you go. There's two ways of doing that. One is Option or Alt key right in the middle and slide back forward. The other is to just collapse there and move this globally. And as I say, this is useless if the only thing you changed was one thing. You may as well just be sliding those back and forward. But where you've changed a number of things, do something really stupid here, no idea what this will look like. Where you've changed a number of things, then it's hard to change them in proportion. You kind of like the mix of the edit, but the overall thing's too strong. So how do you adjust all the various things? Well, now we know. We click Option and then we slide, and we can lower the overall global effect. So I hope you found that one useful, and we'll move on to another one now where we're going to be looking at adding some color temperature changes. So quite often when you're doing editing, you want to change the overall white balance by adjusting the temperature, either moving the temperature slide to the left to introduce blues to cool it off, or perhaps move it to the right to add more of a yellow effect to warm it up. And that's all well and good, but I'd like to draw your attention to the histogram up here, particularly over here, which are our highlights. There's our blacks and our highlights. As I move the temperature over, forget what's happening on the picture itself. Notice how everything is moving over to the right. We're not just introducing yellow, which we are now if you look at this. We're actually brightening it up. And if we move the other way, what's happening here is look at all the blues migrating across towards the light side of the histogram. So when you are adjusting the colour balance, you are not just adjusting colour, you're adjusting the luminosity of it. You are brightening the picture, as is very evident if I whack this over to the right. See, all of these have been lifted pretty much in the same way as had I said lift the shadows. Whereas the effect on lifting the shadow here is to move these from the blacks towards the centre, whereas the effect on the temperature was to do that but also move these ones over into the bright as well, something the shadows didn't do. So why didn't the shadow do that? Because the shadow is only going to target this area here. It's not going to target this area, whereas the white balance targets both. You get them both moving. So I found that sometimes, not often, it's actually better to actually paint a colour on. So how do we do that? Well, there's a few ways of doing it, but I like to put a gradient on. So what we'll do is click on the gradient, and I won't put a gradient across either. We know how gradients work. You click and drag your gradient down. This looks awful because exposure was left high. Let's just drop that down. And what happens above, in fact, let's drop the exposure. What happens above these lines gets most of the effect, and what happens below the lines gets a lesser effect. And it reduces towards the central point and then comes out the other side. Much easier seen if I just contract these, not contrast them, down to make a line, and then we do something more solid. Here you can see full effect applied, no effect applied, and then you've got your wash between the two there. So in doing that, we've got our gradient. What we can choose to do is to use a colour. So I will pick any colour I like from this spectrum, and once you've got a colour, you can adjust the saturation point of it. So let's pick this yellow, which was one of the default ones it came with, and just move the saturation down. Now between 0, which means I haven't really impacted the picture, and where I have fully, you look at the histogram up here, we are hardly brightening at all. Yes, there's things moving, but not in the same amount that when we used the actual warming tool here, which really marched everything to the right. So sometimes if you want to introduce a bit of a grade, a bit of a colour contrast, you can actually use something like the graduated filter there and use an actual colour instead. And you can use the colour picker to do that. All right, let's move along to a next tip and pull up another picture. Okay, before we start this last one, because I think we're up to about 18 minutes, and I'll try and keep it not as long as my other ones, which have been going on a little bit. A little favour, if you like these videos and would like to follow along with other videos I post, please consider clicking the subscribe and the bell to be notified of new videos. And if you think this warrants it, click on that thumbs up. There are alternatives to thumbs up, but I'd appreciate you letting me know in comments if that was the case. Anyhow, here we go. The last tip for now is the use of Alt and Shift when editing. Now we all know when we have a picture, we can always just click on Auto, and I nearly said Photoshop, and Lightroom will decide what it thinks is the best thing to do for your particular picture. Incidentally, these are the rock piles that appeared over the last year or so down at Whitley Bay, and some of them are marvels of engineering and balance. I would not like to take any of these engineers on at a game of Jenga. But here we go. So you've got Auto, and you might choose to do things yourself. I certainly do, about when I'm editing. But if you hold your Shift key and click on any one single one, like whites and blacks, Lightroom will put in the value it thinks is the appropriate one. Now, I said this about Shift and Alt. If I hold down Alt on a PC or Option on a Mac and slide the whites, it's totally black, so we're not clipping it any whites. We're not blowing out. But now we are starting just to blow it a tiny bit. But if you look at the histograms, hardly anything. So I'm holding down my Option key here or Alt on a PC, and I can see where I'm going to blow out. So one way to try and get good whites pushed as far as you want would be to hold down the Alt and just look for the little dots to start appear. That would be your optimum point of whites before you're really starting to lose any information that's in there. And with the blacks too. So Option or Alt and come down with the blacks. Now I think in the blacks you can sometimes afford to lose detail, so I'm not too bothered about having blacks creep in. And that's where I put those. Similarly, when you're applying likes in detail, when you're applying sharpening, it's very difficult sometimes to see the effect of sharpening. On this photograph I can see it happening on this particular tower here, but it's sometimes hard to do. So what you can do is if you hold down the Alt key, it turns it to black and white, and therefore it's a little bit easier to see where your sharpening is going to be applied. I hope you can see that flashing up and down. Now I don't mind applying a lot of sharpening, but not to the whole picture. I like to be selective, so I generally use masking. So if I hold down the Option key and slide the mask along, where it's white is where it's going to apply the sharpening. So I will take it so that it's quite minimal. What is sharpening? Sharpening is where it detects a change in contrast between dark and light and just adds a little bit more, it detects a change between dark and light and adds a little bit more contrast at the border. So you don't really want that to be applied across the whole image like that. It'd be too sharp. The idea is, and sometimes your eye doesn't even tell you this is happening, but it does notice. It makes a difference between one picture and another as to why you might like it, is to try and get just the edges there. And that was by the use of the Option key. So a number of these, I'll leave you to explore, a number of these can be influenced by using the Alt key and the Shift key. Let's do one more before I sign off. So I'm going to just do general exposure here, up or down. You can clearly see that's blown out. But let's hold down the Alt key or Option key on a Mac and see for ourselves. Similar to the whites and blacks, you can see here where we're starting to overexpose. So that might help you in your judgment of where you want to put the slider. And of course, you always have clipping here for whites and blacks. So I've turned those on, and the blue is telling me these are places where the black is clipped. And if I had any red, let's get some red in by deliberately throwing the highlights up. I'm starting to see here where I've blown things out on there. So there's a number of things to help and guide you with that. To be honest, I rarely use the clipping here. I just eyeball the histogram, but I do use the Alt key or Option key when I'm sliding some of these. I just find it's easier to tell me, it's easier for me to tell by that sort of view what I'm really doing to the darks as opposed to by eye. What was the difference between there and there? Yes, some, but how much detail have I lost? Well, if I hold the Alt key, it's more relevant. Anyway, I've probably witted on a bit longer than I thought I would, so broke the 20-minute rule. Not that it's a rule, it was a rule just for this video, and I've broken it. 100% success. Right, that's me out of here. Until the next one, I'll see you later. Bye-bye.